Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Heart to Heart series. My name is Kevin Ring, president of FAMM. I don't think I've been more excited about a show. We wait all week for this because we are so excited to have Chris Young with us today. This is like a homecoming, a long lost homecoming for somebody you've never met. We know Chris's story, and if you've seen The Vanishing Trial, you know it too. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're so glad that he's here to join us today. And we're also glad to have returning guests, Brittany Barnett, who is Chris's attorney and who's also the founder of the Buried Alive Project, where she works on other cases of people who received excessive sentences, life sentences, and she's getting them out of prison. And Judge Kevin Sharp, who is a friend of FAMM's, a great advocate, was on the federal bench and actually sentenced Chris to the life sentences he served. And so, as I mentioned, Chris is an integral part of the documentary we made called The Vanishing Trial. And that film was about the trial penalty, which is the incredible excessive sentence people receive simply for exercising their constitutional right to trial. If you plead guilty and cooperate, you're going to get a much shorter sentence. But if you think you're innocent or you want to put the government to its proof and you assert your right to trial, you can get hammered with a long sentence. In Chris's case, was the epitome of the trial penalty. And so we want to start with a brief clip from the film, and then we'll come back and talk to everybody.
Was found guilty. At his sentencing, he poured out his heart in an hour-and-a-half long speech in which he shared what he had taught himself in jail.
So if I was given the opportunity to be released back into society within a reasonable amount of time, I know that I could be a positive, productive person. I could be an example to the many young men and women in my neighborhood. I could be an influence or example to the man who's been recently released from prison, who's trying to get his life back on track and provide for his family, all the while staying out of trouble. So as you can see, I've been working on this for a couple months now, or about a year. And I just want to say thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you for treating me like a man, and thank you for looking at me like a man. Because others, they naturally look at us as something else. And it's because we done made some mistakes and we're on the other side of the law. But I want to say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And everyone, just have a good day.
I said the words, "You're sentenced to life in prison," and I'm thinking, what a waste. What a waste of human potential. What a waste of a young man's life. And what a waste for us.
Chris Young is serving the same amount of time as a Unabomber because he turned down a plea offer to use his constitutional right to proceed to trial.
All right. Well, Chris, I want to start with you, of course. Take us to that moment, if you could. I want to talk about your being free, but take us to that moment when you were sentenced to life. And did you think you'd end up at some point getting out?
Yes, sir. I honestly believe that's what helped me get out. The fact that I allowed myself to embrace freedom, to believe in freedom. Because your mentality equals your reality. What you allow yourself to think, that will ultimately be how you react. Did I have to wake up every day and face the fact that legally I was sentenced to the custody of the BOP until I was pronounced deceased? By law, until I was pronounced deceased, I was not supposed to leave the custody of the BOP. So that went through my mind every day. But I always believed that I was going to be free one day.
How'd you keep hope?
My own self-determination and will. I applied my work ethic towards positive and productive activities, working out, reading, just staying focused and all around trying to get myself to a point where I would be beneficial to society and to humanity.
And so you got clemency from President Trump a few weeks ago. And
yes, sir.
What was that feeling like?
It was amazing. It was unbelievable. I had been fortunate enough that my attorney, Ms. Brittany K. Barnett, never gave up on me, and she got a very rare win in the court and got my sentence reduced in the summer of 2020 But unfortunately, I still had some more years to go. But given the fact that the way the federal system houses its inmates, my custody level was no longer a maximum security inmate. But due to COVID-19, I could not be transferred. So I was just placed in the segregated housing unit, which most guys incarcerated call the hole. So I had been in the hole for about 4 months because my sentence got changed in September. So I didn't even know she was still pushing for the clemency, and I definitely didn't know I had got it. So the day that it was time to get released, it was amazing to me. It was unbelievable.
How did you find out? Who told you?
One of the lieutenants, he came to the door and he was smiling very hard, and I kind of thought he was horseplaying. I didn't know what he wanted, but he just said, "Young, come here." And when he got to telling me, "You finna go home," I just stared at him. I was like, "You for real?" He was like, "You want to go or what?" I said, "Yes, sir. Let's go."
And what's it been like? I mean, you were going a long time. What's it been like? 3 weeks. I mean, how's the adjustment? What's it feel like?
It's been beautiful. It's been amazing. But I've been blessed. I've been fortunate. If I didn't have people like Miss Brittany Barnett and Judge Sharp, I guarantee it would have been a harder transition. But due to the fact that I was blessed with individuals like them, the transition was a lot easier. Also, the other benefactors, such as Mr. Mark Holden and Mr. Doug Deason, guys that supported me from day one and guys that are taking their own initiative to help make sure I can transition back into society, it's been a beautiful opportunity.
That's awesome. Brittany, I want to ask you, for people who didn't see the film, can you just give them the thumbnail of how Chris ended up with a life sentence to begin with?
Chris was serving life without parole under the 3 strikes law, if you will, on the federal level, which means your 3rd drug felony was a mandatory life without parole sentence. No matter how old the prior drug felonies were, no matter how minor the prior drug felonies were, it was a mandatory life sentence upon conviction at trial. And what is really interesting about the 3 strikes, or the 851 enhancement, as we call it on the federal level, is that a lot of people don't know that it is at the sole discretion of the prosecutor whether or not to enhance a person's sentence based on prior drug convictions. And once the prosecutor, in his or her sole discretion, makes that decision, there's absolutely nothing that anyone can do. And in Chris's situation, the most frustrating part, infuriating part, was that this prosecutor did not enhance Chris Young's sentence until he declined the plea offer and opted to utilize his constitutional right to go to trial.
And how did you first learn about his case?
I learned about Chris's case through a journalist from Vice News who had wrote just this amazing piece about Chris Young. And she had also covered some of the work that I did back in 2016 regarding clemency under the Obama administration. And so she connected us in early 2017.
Yeah, we were looking at it. I think the first time we heard from Chris through Corlinks, which is the email system, was 2017. I don't know if you used to get the emails, Chris, but that's when our staffs, the first time they heard from you. The first time I became aware, I guess, more specifically about his case was when Judge Sharp decided to leave the bench. There were articles about you, Judge Sharp, and how you were not resigning, retiring from a life position. You could have done that for the rest. Am I right about that?
Resigned rather than retired.
Okay, resigned rather than retired. I always get that wrong. You left the bench, lifetime appointment. In the initial articles, talked about Chris's case as being one of the ones that stuck out to you that you couldn't sort of stomach anymore. And so before I talk about that, I just want to say, how surreal is it to be sitting here with Chris and Brittany and talking about this?
You know, it's well. First, let me go back. I wish I had retired, because if I retired, I get paid for life. By resigning, they cut off my pay. It depends on today. It's not as surreal. It's incredible to be here and have this opportunity to talk to them. But when I sentenced Chris, I thought this is it. I'm just giving him 2 life sentences. I'll never see or hear from him again. But when I met Brittany, and after I left the bench and she came to Nashville and we sat down and she started talking about this, was the first time I went, you know what? I think she can pull this off. And I really had hope. And there got to be a point where I didn't think that Chris was going to die in prison. Didn't know how he was going to get out, but I just, the story, and having sat in the Oval Office and talked to President Trump about his case, the case was just too compelling. And I just thought, I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's not going to end with him dying in prison. And so Chris talks about having that same hope. I had that sense as well. And it's helpful because otherwise, what a depressing story it would otherwise be, because Chris really became the poster child for what bothered me about the criminal justice system. And so, I would think about him daily. And it was helpful to be able to think not daily about Chris dying in prison, but about what it's going to be like when he gets out. Didn't really envision this setup, but I like it. Lets me see Chris more often.
Yeah. Well, let me. So Brittany, you shared a video. I think it was yours, and we all stole it and shared it ourselves. Video of Chris arriving, I think, at Nashville Airport and Judge Sharp, and that reunion. And it was incredibly moving to everyone who saw it. We got a lot of comments and thoughts. And the biggest thing everybody said was, I can't believe that that's his judge. Because so many people, they don't think about their judge favorably, especially if they've been sent away for life. Chris, how did it feel knowing that your judge who did that was fighting for you on the outside, doing things like going to the White House, advocating every chance he got, leaving the bench because of it? That had to be a good feeling.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. It was an amazing feeling. It was a feeling that kept me very sentimental when it came to Judge Sharp and my situation. It pulled on all the strings of my heart, because at the end of the day, you don't see that too often. And you definitely don't see the positive outcome, such as me being here free, conversing with you guys right here on this live.
Yeah, I want to ask you something. I was going to wait, but so many people who watch this will have a loved one in prison, and they're going to want to have the hope you have. But you also have a recent experience that we're focused on, and you just alluded to when you first spoke, which is the conditions in prison right now.
Mhm.
I know I was talking to Brittany about, towards the end, we were like, what your status was and what was going on with your case. And she mentioned that you were in isolation for a period because of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, especially compared to the rest of your time? I mean, was it just awful at the end? Because I know a lot of people were worried about their loved ones inside.
Oh, yes, sir. Whether this is inappropriate or not, I have to be candid.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Bureau of Prisons has used COVID-19 as an excuse to put the most restrictive and punitive actions into play. It's other ways to go about keeping them guys healthy. And unfortunately, as we have seen from the statistics, we know they're not keeping them healthy. They're still contracting COVID-19. And unfortunately, some people have passed away from COVID-19. So it's no point of treating the inmates, the guys, the men and women, the way they're treating them, because it's not saving or preventing or helping anything. And at the end, it was the worst part of my sentence, the worst part of my incarceration.
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about that. I mean, were you getting out for showers or phone calls? Recreation, I think, was gone. How about food? These are a lot of the things we're hearing about. What was it
Yes,
like?
sir. No recreation at all. No recreation at all. And the Bureau of Prisons has a statute, a policy that says that every inmate has the right to get a shower within once of every 72 hours. Unfortunately, at the United States Penitentiary that I was held at, like I said, I was at the maximum security level. I haven't been at the other security levels to know how they're getting treated, but at that level, guys are staying locked in their cell all day, and unfortunately, sometimes going a whole week without a chance to bathe. And that is not how a man or a woman should be treated. And when I was actually in the hole is called the hole for a reason. True enough, that is a nickname. It's a nomenclature that's placed on it for the slang term, but it's really like a hole. They have the windows covered up. There's no reason why we can't see outside. and it's no recreation, it's no commissary, so the food, you have less access to food. There's no reason to treat anyone like that, and COVID-19 should not be the excuse to treat anyone like that.
Yeah, and I don't want to bring us down, but I just know a lot of people are going through this right now, and I think your voice could be helpful in talking about what you experienced. But I will say this: if the expression "it's always darkest before the dawn," I mean, you had your worst 4 months, and then you got this great news, so that must have felt even sweeter.
Yes, sir. Yes,
You know, to
sir.
get out of that. Brittany, I want to talk a little bit about Judge Sharp mentioned, being at the White House and bringing Chris's case. And I agree that there are certain cases that just stand for injustice, that make it so easy to think like, this is what I'm talking about. Any system that produces this result, something's wrong with it. But I also know there's a lot of people who think like, I can't get to the White House. But you work on all sorts of cases. You work in cases that aren't as popular as Chris is. How can they have hope? I mean, how do they get their cases out there and get attention to these? And how does that contrast with did Chris's just like everything line up perfectly for you? Because you had people dying to tell his story.
Yeah, for me in the situation that I was in, I think at the time, what many people don't know is Chris Young was the only case that I was working on. The Buried Alive project didn't exist when I took on Chris Young's case. And so as I have begun to work with Kim Kardashian on Alice Johnson's case, and once we secured freedom for Alice Johnson, Chris was literally the only client that I had. And so I took his case to Kim, and she was just really moved by it because it was so compelling and it was so just heartbreaking. And because it really shows just how much is flawed with this system. And so for me, even though Chris Young is the case that we went to the White House with and we pushed a lot publicly, it was a lot bigger than Chris Young because his story showed that there were hundreds and thousands of other Chris Youngs who were buried alive under these outdated federal drug laws. And so now that the Buried Alive project has launched, it's so funny now even thinking about it because we launched in 2018, but Chris actually helped like with the website design and everything from behind those walls. And so now that it's launched, we work on cases every day that are very similar to Chris Young's. And, my hope is that we get to a place where it doesn't have to take a celebrity, to be able to free people. And for people to know that even without celebrity support and influence, like we've been able to free dozens of people that people don't even know about. And so I hope that people in prison maintain their hope and conviction because people are out here working and people are out here helping to free people from those cages and uplift the work for sure. Yeah. I'm hopeful that Chris's story just inspires them and knows to never give up. And yeah, I'm hopeful that the dawn will come for many, 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 many people.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a bittersweet thing because the clemency process was so flawed, but I don't care who signed Chris's petition. Somebody should have freed him, right? So that's a weird thing. And I don't begrudge celebrities for being involved. In fact, they do bring attention to it in a way that we can't. And yet some people can get hopeless thinking if they don't have a celebrity pushing their case, that they don't have a chance. But I think your work has proven that that's not true. We already had a question asking if you only work on, I'm afraid you're going to get inundated, but people are asking if you only work on federal cases or do you do state cases as well?
I only work on federal cases of people serving life sentences for drugs.
All right. Well, okay, Kevin, we're sending them to you.
I wish there were more of me because I would help everybody if I could.
Back on your question about the celebrity issue, it's stories that move people, and this is why Chris's story is so much bigger than Chris. That everybody ought to be, celebrating what happened here because his story becomes this much bigger global story. Even if people had celebrities and more people had celebrities, there still aren't enough celebrities to start doing this one by one by one. It would take forever and there are way too many people. What you need is a story like Chris's that becomes the poster child, for lack of a better term, to inform people, educate people about the problem with the system. You know, for First Step Back, Matthew Charles was another one of those people. It was such a great story. Happened to be one of my cases. That was just happenstance. But, you know, Matthew's story became this kind of universal story that helps to explain why the First Step Act is so important. And I think Chris's story does that, hopefully with regard to mandatory minimums as well, not just the clemency process, but the whole process on how he ended up in that situation.
I hope people don't draw from this, from your work on Matthew's case and Chris's case, that you're the problem.
The solution. I don't want to be either one. I think you're in trouble.
I want to say that, like, I obviously totally agree. FAMM's whole theory of change is that telling the stories of people impacted by these laws is what's going to make the difference. We cannot go into offices and just talk about recidivism statistics and crime rates and, you know, all these sorts of facts and figures without putting a human face on it. And it is the case that stories like Chris's and Matthew's and Sharonda Jones, which was a Brittany case, and others are what change hearts and minds. When people are moved and see something that's unfair, then they'll figure out the arguments that justify why they should act.
Right.
But it's really heart first. Did you guys say something?
It's the only way it works.
Yeah. So Chris, I want to talk a little bit about your transition. What are you doing now? I mean, it's only been a little while, but like, how have you jumped back in, and what are you up to?
The biggest part of my transition is actually staying abreast with the learning curve and also assisting my attorney, Ms. Brittany K. Barnett. Technology moves at a steady pace. And with that being said, unfortunately, a lot of guys get left behind when they're in prison. They're not aware of how a lot of things operate. Nowadays, everything's operating with technology in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And that's why, unfortunately, the Bureau of Prisons is lacking with this actual rehabilitation attempts. Because if they was truly attempting to rehabilitate, they would attempt to keep people aware of the technology that's necessary to survive out here. And you have to be able to maneuver out here, and you have to be able to operate the software, the hardware, so forth and so on. Unfortunately, that is not something we have access to when we're in there. We're not privy, and we don't know exactly what's going on unless you attempt to know it on your own. So that's why I always was fortunate enough to have people give me subscriptions to Fortune, Forbes, Entrepreneur, CNET, MIT Technology, just anything that could keep me aware of not only business maneuvers, but technology upgrades and technological innovations. So I want to help bridge the gap, not only between the streets and innovative technology, but between the prison and innovative technology, because it could be a lot more better, and it could help raise the level of comfort for a lot of human beings.
I wasn't going to ask this, Chris, but I'm listening to you talk, and I you know, we have a member of our board, Norman Brown, who got a 3-strike life sentence, and now he's working as a credible messenger in DC. And if you spend any time with Norman, you think, I can't believe we were going to let this person die in a prison cell. And anybody listening to you is going to think the same thing. But did you need to go to prison? Was this you, 15 years ago? Were you on a different path and you decided, I've got to do something differently? Or how do you look back at that?
I needed correcting. I don't think I needed prison, but I did needed some form of assistance, help. And for lack of a better word, rehabilitation. I think punishment is the wrong word, because punishment has a connotation of suffering, and a person shouldn't have to suffer. A person should be corrected. He should be assisted. He should be guided and directed. Most drug offenses consist of a person either trying to make money or a person addicted to the substance. So we need to either help the person that's addicted to the substance, and then the person that's selling the drugs, we need to channel his entrepreneur efforts the right way. Teach him how to thrive in the corporate world with his work ethic, his ambitions, and teach him that he has transferable skills. A lot of guys that sell drugs have skills that can apply in the legal system in the corporate world. They're either good salesmen, good marketers, or some of them, and it's not right what they're doing with them, but are actually good chemists. And we need to make them realize that those are transferable skills that they can thrive with in the corporate world. So yes, I needed correcting, and I needed some type of assistance and guidance and directing. I did.
Well, no, that was just a fantastic answer. I really like the way you contrast correcting with punishment and what you called suffering. And sometimes I worry that the people who support these punitive laws, they really want people to suffer. And so even with the spread of COVID, and we've been talking about the need of, saving people's lives. They didn't get life sentences. Now they're dying in prison because COVID. And people said, well, you did the crime, you got to do the time. Well, the time didn't include being, trapped in a global pandemic. But I worry that some people, are okay with that suffering. And that's really a great answer. Judge Sharp, we got a question about you, which for you about, you were stuck in a system where you felt like you had to give that sentence, but do you think there's other judges that, feel similarly trapped or would like to do things differently?
Oh, I think, maybe it's the judges that I was friends with. I found that to be the attitude of most judges. There's a handful out there who like mandatory minimums and think you can't be harsh enough. But even without the mandatory minimum, hell, they might do that, give that sentence anyway. Most of the judges, far and away, the majority of the judges that I talked to about this were against them and didn't like doing it, didn't like handing out, whether it's a mandatory life sentence or, mandatory lesser sentences. And I had to hand out, there weren't as many life sentences as, 15-year, 20-year mandatory sentences, which were still too harsh. And, if you want me to be the judge here, then let me judge. If you want me to send a message and deliver your message from Congress that we're going to show everybody how tough on crime we can be, then get somebody else to do that. I have better things I can do, and we can make some changes to society. I'm not your messenger.
Yeah, somebody asked. They said, how has your perspective changed because of this situation? And I don't think it was just this situation, though. I mean, and can you talk about, the evolution of seeing that you were just being this messenger, and also people are asking, like, what are you doing now? Like, from having learned this experience, how does it guide what you do today?
I didn't, when I took the bench, I had been doing civil rights work, but as a civil litigator, not doing criminal work. And I wasn't as familiar as I should have been until I got on the bench, that I become familiar with mandatory minimums. The sentencing guidelines are not mandatory. And by and large, they were kind of helpful to tell me what would be a similar range across the country, but they weren't mandatory. And so that was, sentencing guidelines were okay, although I looked at them and decided from the very beginning they were much too harsh. But okay, at least it gives me something to start with. The mandatory minimums were so out of whack. On occasion, I might say, if I had the choice, yeah, I'm going to be somewhere in there. But I can count those on two fingers when that happened. Usually the mandatory minimum forced me to give a sentence that I never would have given, but for being directed to do that. And that's when it kind of hit me. And I've given this analogy before of the Apocalypse Now scene where Sheen has been sent to kill the Brando character, and Brando says, you're not a soldier, you're a errand boy sent to collect a bill by a grocer. And that's how I ended up feeling. You don't need me for this job. You didn't need me to have the education I had. You didn't need to vet me. You didn't need to investigate me as part of the FBI and the Judiciary Committee. You can get anybody to deliver this message. And that's when I had to decide if I believe what I'm saying, and I do, am I more valuable on the bench or off the bench? And there was a law firm, civil rights law firms, goes into your second part of your question, social justice law firm, Sanford Heisler, that said, we want you to come. We want you to be a lawyer and, do those things you need to do to make money and feed your family and help keep this law firm on track and surviving. But, to the extent you want to talk about these issues, we want you to talk about these issues because they're important to you. They're important to us as well as you. So that's kind of where I am right now, doing these kind of events, talking and speaking out about mandatory minimums and the criminal justice system and our need to treat not just Chris Young, but all of the Chris Youngs out there as the human beings that they are. Seeing the clip from the film brought me back to that day again. And here's Chris. He is a human being. He's in an orange jumpsuit, and he's done some bad things, which even Chris would admit. He's made mistakes, but he's still a human. And we are all humans, and so we have to treat each other that way. We have to, engage with each other as other human beings, and this system does not do that.
Yeah, so much of I know Brittany's experience with the system was personal with her mother's situation, which she wrote about in her book. And it's, for me, having gone into the system, I was educated by having been somebody who was on the other side of this issue and then getting in trouble, and then opening my eyes to the power that prosecutors had. And I'm sorry that for so many of us, it takes a personal experience to learn these problems, especially if you come from a different place like I did. Chris, having been in there, as we look to get people out who don't have the backing that you had, or maybe even as good a story as you had, are there people you left behind that you think these stories need to be told? I mean, is that something you think about when you were inside? It's just like, there's people like me who don't need to be here?
Yes, sir. I thought about it while I was in there, and I think about it every day while I'm out here. Unfortunately, as Judge Sharp spoke on, our federal sentencing guidelines doesn't put all the integers and variables into the equation. Only thing they consider is the crime. They don't consider the human being behind the crime. So there's several individuals that I think about. And I know that if it was up to me, because I've got a chance to meet the human being, meet the person they are today, not the person they were when they committed their crime, or even judging them by their crime. I'm judging them by their actions at that moment in time. And yes, sir.
Brittany, do you think things are changing? I mean, you've been doing this for a while, as have we. President Trump, signed the First Step Act, but he was not. No one would conceive of him as soft on crime, and yet it did seem like some of these cases, like Alice Marie Johnson's, and in the end, Chris's, obviously got somebody thinking this is unjust. Somebody who has a different background, and so is that a sign that we're making progress? That sort of like a relatively conservative administration was willing to use clemency, or how do you sort of view this in a bigger picture about where we're headed?
I think that it is a sign, and it's a buildup of signs even from the Obama administration, where clemencies are granted at a mass scale, well, more mass than normal, and so I think from the Obama administration coming into the Trump administration with the First Step Act passing, it is a sign of progress. I'm just hopeful that we don't rest too much, and know that there's a lot more work to do, because even as people are being freed from the First Step Act, and it's amazing, but are we looking at the people that are still coming into prison on the backside? And are we looking at retroactivity in the First Step Act? It wouldn't have taken such this effort, even for Chris Young, for example, if the 851 provisions in the First Step Act were made retroactive. He would have walked out the door 2 years ago, and so I'm hopeful. I think it's a great sign that people are embracing and understanding that this criminal legal system is flawed in its design, and that we have to completely transform it. And so that definitely gives me hope, but even with that hope, that should propel us forward to
one of the things you've got to be careful with on that, just with that question kind of tells you this. Are we moving forward? We are moving forward, but you also have to be careful that it doesn't create this moral license where you go, look, we passed the First Step Act. What more do you people want? And then they move on and say, I've done it. Similar to, and I first heard this term used with respect to the election of President Obama. Well, look, there's no racism. Look, we elected a black president. We're done. No, we're not. We're not done. And somehow that becomes a moral license. So, I want to be careful with criminal justice reform that we don't say, well, look, we did these good things. Chris is out and First Step Act was passed. We cannot quit, and you have to stay in their face and keep this thing moving forward.
I 100% agree with that. The only thing I would say is that I think people want to know it's achievable, that what you're seeking can accomplish things. And so I think there's a difference between celebrating progress and being complacent. And so we certainly don't want to be complacent. But when I started FAMM, the prison population was 2.3 million. It's 1.8. That's 500,000 fewer people. Is 1.8 too high? Absolutely. But it's
Right.
like if you set a goal of losing 50 pounds at the 25-pound mark, you'd say, all right, I'm on the right track. This is working. I'm going to keep doing it. So I want to have people buy in. And one thing, Brittany, that always, I feel like sometimes it's the dog that didn't bark, that people don't talk about. I think about President Obama's clemencies, which still gets criticism for not doing more. But he commuted 1,700 sentences. There were several hundred lifers.
Mm-hmm.
We don't hear about that at all.
Yeah.
You don't even, I mean, they were going to die in prison cells, hundreds of people. There's no crime wave that people are talking about caused by these people. It's almost like I feel like there's this huge fear, but once you break through it, you realize we were pushing out an open door because there's nothing there to fear about letting somebody like Chris Young, only serve a decade or two as opposed to life. And so I agree, we've got to keep our head down and keep going. But I think you have to tell the stories of progress, not because you're complacent, but because you want that buy-in from people. I guess I'm asking you, Brittany, to talk about how do we not be complacent? But to me, Chris needs to be everywhere because people have to see what success looks like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I agree we have to celebrate victories along the way. I think, the question about progress is to keep in mind that even with these victories, there's a lot more work to do. And I think a way to help propel us forward is celebrating and sharing these stories.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't think I think both can coexist.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah.
The other part of this, though, the solutions are hard and people don't like to think. Thinking is hard. And so it reminded me of that with Chris's answer to what I needed was correction, not prison. I mean, part of the problem is that I saw on the bench is by the time someone is standing in front of me in an orange jumpsuit, we've missed so many opportunities to correct along the way. And you've taken away all the options now except for lengthy prison sentences. And so what do you need to do to prevent someone from ending up in this place to begin with? And that's hard. And there's so many moving pieces. People don't want to think about that. They want to think about is let's just lock them up and see how we can do it forever. And this individual will never commit another crime. Well, that's true, but you haven't solved the crime problem. What is it you're trying to solve?
Right.
And those are hard questions with complex answers. And it's takes a lot of will to actually, follow through with those.
Well, and unfortunately, clemency is still pretty rare. And until we get more mechanisms in place like second look laws, compassionate release, other tools and mechanisms to revisit these long sentences, clemency can feel like a lottery. Judge Sharp, you brought up race about President Obama. Chris, having gone through this experience, I want you to talk about your perspective as a Black man going through the prison system in the United States and how you saw race play. What role did it play in, you think, sort of your journey and how things went in prison, court, everything?
The factor of race plays a factor before prison becomes a part of the equation. Before prison is even met, as Judge Sharp said, we have forgotten that certain demographics and certain areas of society need assistance and need help. And when I say help, I'm not talking about charity and free handouts. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about guidance and direction. And that is not taken into account. So unfortunately, the preschool to prison pipeline is flooded. It's continuing every day, all day. You have young men and women going straight from high school to prison. Most of the time dropping out of high school and going to prison. The race factor, unfortunately, is something taken into account every single day in prison, because the prison is broken down into different groups most of the time based off of race. And that is something that the administration themselves have instituted. It's not something the inmates have done. It's when you come through the door, the first thing they're going to say is, what car are you a part of? You can play dumb and be like, okay, what car? I don't know what you're talking about. What state you from? Then they're going to automatically mark your file some type of way. Even if you're not a part of an official street gang, you'll become a part of a prison gang based off of just how the administration does its intake, does its processing. So unfortunately, race plays a large factor even before prison, and most definitely during prison.
Do you feel like you were treated different by corrections officers?
Not based on race, based on my sentence.
Gotcha.
I'll admit that. I had several admit to me that if I hadn't have spoke to you, I would have never known you was like that, because your file says life, and automatically they will admit they're taught to treat the guys with the longer sentences different than the guys with the shorter sentences. They're taught to think that the guy with the long sentence is going to commit some type of violation, some type of infraction, some type of crime while in prison more often than the guy with the lesser sentence. When they fail to realize the guy with the long sentence, especially me specifically, I'm aiming to get free. I'm aiming to stay out of trouble because I don't want to leave here when I'm pronounced deceased. I want to leave here while I'm still healthy and able to help society and humanity. So yes, sir. You know, whether it be a visit, it was several times that I was at visit, I felt like I was harassed, and they admitted to me, well, you know, when we processed you in, it says you had a life sentence, so we're taught to watch you harder than we're taught to watch the guy who's getting ready to go home in a year. We're taught to treat you different because we assume that you don't care, you have nothing to lose, when they fail to realize I had everything to lose. I had my life to lose.
Yeah.
Well, it's why the second look acts are so important. But eliminate that. Everyone with a lengthy sentence then would have the opportunity to have a sentence re-sentencing. So it's part of that same problem. But you know also that, you know, as part of the pre-sentence report, back to Chris's point as well, that, you know, you've got to do something to help people stay out of that pipeline and end up in a federal court in an orange jumpsuit. And the number of people who would come through, defendants, and they're in their late 20s, early 30s, sometimes 40s, and I would ask, what have you been doing for employment since high school? And the number of times that I got as an answer, nothing. They have not held a job. And so now we're back to, okay, it's not just education, but we've got to create opportunities for people to do something other than what landed them here. And that's part of what I'm talking about too. It becomes complicated and it's hard. And it requires something other than passing a law that says, well, let's just put them in prison longer.
I want to talk a little bit about the trial penalty. That was the subject of the documentary, The Vanishing Trial, and, you know, which we featured Chris's case. And, you know, one thing we couldn't get at with your case, Chris, because you were in, and I think they wanted to tell through my story, is what it was like to have to make that choice of going to trial or not. So for those who didn't know, I think you were in the end confronted with a 14-year plea offer. What was going through your head when you rejected that? And what was your thought process? Or, you know, were you clear-minded about like what are the risks and benefits, or how did you process that choice?
Honestly, my choice came from the fact that I understand that in the federal system, there's no parole. You have to do 85% of your time. And unfortunately, if you get in trouble, you can end up doing 100% of your time. So a young man at 22 being told he was not going to be released till he was 36, and at the best 34, that's a long time. And I didn't believe that I needed to sit in prison that long, especially given the fact that I knew what I did. And I did know I needed correcting. As I said, unfortunately, prison is more about punishment than correcting, but I was in that position. I was ready to go to prison. I was willing to plead guilty, but not to sign over my whole life. And the fact that going to trial is supposed to be a constitutional right, That is one of the biggest misconceptions ever, because how is it a right? Right means you have permission to do so. But if I'm going to be punished for it, that means it's not a right. That means I don't have permission to do so. That's the same thing as selling the drugs from get-go. My free will tells me I can do it, but I have a punishment that comes with it. So technically, I'm not having that right. So how am I having a right to trial if I get punished for it? That is a misconception that most people think and believe. You go to trial, you're finna be punished for going to trial.
Yeah. I just want to, I think I see advocacy in your future. And I'm going to tell you to prepare for that question, because so many people in law enforcement, prosecutors, or associations, or sheriffs or groups will say to us, well, you gambled and lost. And it is a very frustrating thing to hear, because you're not supposed to, as you say, gamble with what's a constitutional right. I mean, it just seems so perverse to me that they would have thought 14 years was enough for you, right? The prosecutor who says their job is keeping the public safe, they made a determination that giving you 14 years meant that no more than that was necessary to keep the public. But when the judge then had to sentence you to life, they didn't stand up and say, this is an incredible miscarriage of justice. Every year over 14 years, every day over 14 years is a waste for this guy because he doesn't need it. And you only got it because you went to trial.
Yes, sir. And it's because the prosecutor chose for it. He had the discretion. So he definitely wasn't going to stand up and say, no, he doesn't need this much, because he was choosing for it to happen.
Because you opted to exercise your constitutional right.
Exactly.
Right. If you do this, you're gonna face a life sentence as opposed to 14 years. Right.
Yeah.
It makes no sense if you give a right that you cannot legitimately exercise. Then what's the right?
Well, how do you fix it?
Well, get rid of mandatory minimums. That's the way to fix it. And so that a judge on the bench can use his or her discretion to decide what's a sufficient punishment. And that you can't have this stacking by prosecutors as a punishment, not because they think this will best serve justice. They did it to punish him in Chris's case. They did it to punish him for making them go to trial. And that's what they don't want to do, because the system, and I've heard Brittany say this before, not to steal her thunder, but she says the system works as it was intended to work. And if you want to go to trial, you throw a wrench into the system and it can't move. And so you've got to make sure people don't want to go to trial. You just get them to plead guilty and let's go. Who's next? Step up.
And I'll add, Kevin, as we talk about, even in light of the Vanishing trial, and we talk about this prosecutorial discretion, like, I really feel a lot more light should be shed on that. I tried to do some data analysis when I first launched the Buried Alive project with SMU in Dallas at Doug Deason's Center. We analyzed over 30 years of data from the United States Sentencing Commission. And there is just absolutely, it seemed like the more we dug, the less transparent the data was, of like, who are these prosecutors that are aggressively pursuing these 851 mandatory minimums? What districts are they in? What we did find, though, is you could be in the Northern District of Florida and 99% of the people who are eligible to have their sentences enhanced, prosecutors are enhancing them. But you could be right, not even 100 miles away in the Southern District of Georgia, and less than 25% of people who are eligible to have their sentences enhanced are being enhanced, and so there needs to be a lot more light shed on this prosecutorial power and unfettered discretion that they have. And, I would be interested in some sort of data project as well to really see, it's mind-blowing to me as a corporate lawyer coming from a corporate background where I did mergers and acquisitions. We would never invest millions and billions of dollars in a company and not track the data and the outcomes. And so when I started doing this work more full-time and saw how just ridiculous the data is, all the holes in the data, and we're investing, 80 billion plus in incarceration a year, it's just mind-boggling that there's not a lot more data that is available for us to really be able to fight this issue and end the mandatory minimums.
Well, and we've talked about this before, Kevin. It's an analogy that I use. They talk about mandatory minimums as a way to take discretion away from the judges so that you have consistency in these sentences, but you haven't taken away discretion. You've only given it to somebody who has a vested interest in the way this thing comes out. And so it's like, if your judge is your umpire, we're going to say, let's let the pitcher call balls and strikes. Well, wait a minute. What am I doing out here? And why are you letting the pitcher call balls and strikes? They have an interest in the pitch. So that's all you've done. You're just shifting who has discretion to somebody who has an interest. And that then leads to injustice.
Yeah, and I think you don't have to think poorly of prosecutors to just realize if you set up a bad system, you get bad outcomes, right? If you're a hammer, everything's a nail. If you're a prosecutor and you think you're going to be judged by convictions, well, you can get them faster if you can bludgeon people into pleading guilty.
And you are, and that is how they're judged. How many convictions did you get?
Right. And length of sentence. In terms of, I just want to say, of course, FAMM agrees with you. The only way you get at the bulk of trial penalties is to eliminate mandatory sentences so judges are not boxed in to then ultimately carry through the prosecutor's threat and give that long sentence. I also think that judges need to be more involved in plea negotiations, because when you have that first person, the kingpin, if it is, or whoever the leader is, come in and get the deal, and judge signs off, rubber stamps a plea agreement, I think the judge needs to say, what else is coming down the pike? How are these punishments going to fit? Am I, because in my case, the first person in was the head of it, and they accept a short plea deal, not knowing that 3 years later they're going to ask for 4 times that for somebody else. Right. But a judge, has to have more involvement, I think, there too. And then the last thing I was going to say is prosecutors have a role, as Brittany said.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking right now, the Biden administration asking all of the U.S. attorneys to resign, and he's going to appoint, his own crew of U.S. attorneys. And the Senate should be asking them, how are you going to use your charging discretion? Because Brittany's right. You have some federal prosecutors who always seek enhancements and some who don't. And they should be asked about that. As you said, Judge Sharp, when you got nominated, there's questionnaires filled out. You had a hearing. They asked you questions about your philosophy. We don't ask U.S. attorney nominees anything. They just get onto the bench. They just get these positions with enormous power, and we don't ask them, anything. Brittany, how many of the buried alive cases that you work on end up being trial penalty cases?
Over 70%. From the data that we analyzed, I think it's around 72% of the people who are serving life without parole in federal prison since 1986 went to trial. And the part that you were mentioning is the irony of we're in the system of holding Chris Young accountable for his actions in the streets, but we're not holding these prosecutors accountable for their vindictive actions in the court. And I think we all have a role to play. And I think that's a segment of the different variables in this equation that is not accepting accountability, enough.
Yeah. Chris, did you see how many of the people that you served with and talked to do you think went to trial?
Everyone that I met that had life,
that
he went to trial.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's too many men that have to die or watch their children go from kids to grown men themselves. And sometimes because they had to watch their children go from kids to grown men while they was in prison, they end up meeting their kids in prison while they're still in prison from that original sentence. So we have to realize that the word right, it confers the definition of permission. It's no way in the world that we're supposed to get punished for going to trial if you're saying it's a right. And there's no way in the world that you should think somebody has to die in prison when at the end of the day, all they need is a little bit of guidance and direction, a little assistance on how to employ their energy, employ their entrepreneurial drive, their ambition, and their work ethic. And on the other token, the people that are addicted, they need help, they need assistance. You have to put all the integers and variables in the equation and realize, how did this come about? It didn't just come about because a person sold some drugs, used some drugs, or whatever the crime was, because even a person that happened to steal a TV, they might be addicted, or they might have unfortunate opportunity to get employment, and they need the finance. It's no excuse for crime, but there is a cause for the crime, and we need to see the cause, and we need to prevent the cause, and so we need to help.
Well said. We're gonna do final comments, and Chris, I want to start with you because a lot of people who watch this are members of FAMM who have loved ones in prison. And, especially during COVID, this has been tough to be an advocate for your loved one. There's always fear of retaliation. You're not getting a lot of information from the BOP. And you're worried to death. You're not getting visits. So it's really been a tough time. But I just want to ask you, having been there, what advice would you have for family members who want to support their loved ones? They're worried to death about them. And, what can you tell them about, how to be a good support while taking care of themselves too?
It's cliche, and it's been said before, but we have to hold our elected representatives accountable, all the way from the county level, city level, state level, on up to the federal level. As we just been speaking on, certain things were given by the power of the people, and these elected officials, their employment, their job, their paychecks come from the people. We gave them positions. We gave them that right to get paid to do what they're doing. So we need to hold them accountable. We need to make them understand that the conditions are not humane. It's not how a person should be treated. And that sounds cliche, but it's the best thing that will bring about change, because they have power. It's power in the pen. We've been hearing that for centuries, and it's true. And last but not least, whatever access and form of communication you have, attempt to do it. A short letter, 2 sentences, will brighten up a man's whole day. Unfortunately, right now they're very restrictive on how the mail operates, and so it's a hindrance. But like we said, COVID-19 has led to most prisons being locked down, and guys don't have access to the phone or the email system. So them letters go a long way. So if you could just take 5 minutes out of your day and write 2 to 3 sentences, stuff it in the envelope, make sure the envelope is white and there's no cents, because they will reject the letter. But yes, if you could take the time, 5 minutes of your day, write 2 to 3 sentences, letting that person know you're thinking about them, and drop it in the mailbox. Make sure it's a white envelope with no cents or lipstick marks or anything of that nature. And your elected officials, whether it's an email, phone call, or if you work downtown, go to their actual place of employment and just go through the process and let them know your concerns and let them know what type of change you would like to come about.
That's perfect. Kevin, you can say whatever you want. I'm going to say, tell us how we fix this. Give us you're czar, or you're the tyrant of the United States, and you got to fix this justice system. What do you do?
I think you take away the first thing you do. One, you've got to get rid of mandatory minimums, put the power and the discretion back into the judge that you vetted and investigated and hired them to do this. The other thing you've got to do is quit evaluating prosecutors on the number of convictions and the length of the sentences. Evaluate them on, have they done justice or not. They work for the Justice Department. You take away those 2 big things and you've gone a long way to helping solve the problem. The biggest thing you've got to do, though, is go back to what Chris said. This is a ripple effect. And when you put a parent in prison, you have to understand there's not just one person going to prison. There are a lot of people who are now affected by this, and you end up with this pipeline. So that's the harder long-term thing. The first thing you want to do, get rid of mandatory minimums, start evaluating prosecutors with a different standard. Easy fixes.
Thanks. And Brittany, I don't know if you seated our audience with family members, but somebody's comment was Brittany for president. So, so I don't know if you want to be president, tell us how to fix this, or share anything else before we close.
I'm just going to leave with hope. And my book, A Knock at Midnight, is named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermon, where he talks about how this weary traveler who's knocking on his neighbor's door at midnight seeking loaves of bread is merely seeking the dawn. And the hope and inspiration from that sermon for me that I want to share with the FAMM viewers is that keep knocking and know that the dawn will come.
Well, thank you for that. That's a perfect ending. And I just want to say one thing. Oh, there it is. Mine,
There it is.
yeah, I got mine back here.
Tab for places that I like to.
I just want to say one thing that gives me hope is you all. It's amazing to sort of have come full circle, having made this film and now having Chris out, and the fact that you two are, we're his biggest advocates and keep doing this. And Brittany, your work in getting other people like him out, as you've been doing now for years. And Judge Sharp, using your position, there's not many people who would resign from the bench and take on this cause. And so it's very moving, inspiring. And so I just want to thank you all. I want to thank everybody who's watching, who's pulling for their loved ones right now. I know this is a tough time to have somebody in prison. Please take care of yourself while you advocate for them. And we'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Good to see you, Chris.
It's good to see you every time.
Hey, wait 1 second. We're gonna go into the back room for a second.